getting cut, getting the six pack. How'd my abs look? They look good? Best ab workout ever. Okay, hanging leg raises. I love when I ironically do exercises and then I'm out of breath afterwards. It's awesome. Okay, all right, hanging leg raises. It's a very popular ab movement. And to that I say, sort of. So I'll try to start positive and I'll run through the parts of a hanging leg raise which actually do work the abs, but then I'll finish with probably the most obvious part of the movement, which is actually a hip flexor movement, so I'll leave you on that cliffhanger. Alright, so starting off with, I guess like what most people probably think of as the abs, like what you see as like a six-pack abs. Those look good. My abs cut. Six-pack, so good. That's your rectus abdominis. Those tissues run vertically up and down the body, so their primary function is flexion of the spine. Where do the abs start and finish? Right about here. Work that to the back side. That's roughly where it's working flexion. So unless you're flexing that part of the spine, these aren't moving, these aren't working. So if you're doing a hanging leg raise and you're not getting flexion of the spine, you're not working what most people consider to be the abs, the rectus abdominis. So the other thing the rectus abdominis can do is tilt the pelvis backwards, so it's a posterior tilt. So for the most part, when you get the flexion in the lumbar spine, you're gonna get the pelvis to tilt posteriorly, tilting back. Anterior, posterior, just quick reference. You're gonna get the pelvis to tilt back a little bit, so that's gonna get engagement too. But if your hips are staying neutral and you're not getting flexion of the spine, you're not working the rectus abdominis. So keep that in mind next time you're doing these. So the next thing in your complex of abs that could be working are the external and internal obliques. I say it could be working only if you're doing the movement in a particular way, which you might not be. So if you're rounding the back, if you get flexion through the lumbar spine, then you're engaging the external and internal obliques. Because they're in front of the spine, they're flexors of the lumbar spine. So again, if you're keeping the spine neutral, you're not using the external and internal obliques, you're not using the rectus abdominis. So if you're not getting flexion in the lumbar spine when you're doing these, then you're not using 3 out of the 4 muscles in your abs. Finally, transverse abdominis. This one, a little bit confusing for people. If you've ever seen somebody wear a weight belt when they're lifting, you have one of those naturally built in. It's called your transverse abdominis. So if you've seen somebody wear a weight belt, just imagine that just underneath your stomach. So it wraps all the way around, attaches right about here. Big strip of tissue. These tissues run across. So the transverse abdominis, or the TVA, that's basically, it does exactly what a weight belt does. It helps you brace your midline. So the TVA is basically just a bracing muscle. So you have to think, and the example we kind of just gave before, if you're not getting flexion through the lumbar spine, what are you doing? You're sort of braced in that neutral position. In that case, you will be working the TVA, but you kind of turned off the other 3. Okay, so this whole time, what have I talked about exclusively? Back position, flexion of the lumbar spine. Even though the movement's called a hanging leg raise. Where the hell does the leg raise come in? So you need to think about where these muscles kind of start and what joints they cross. Because a muscle can only work on a joint that it crosses. Meaning the bicep up at the shoulder, all the way down past the elbow. When I bring my hand up, I'm working over the elbow joint because the bicep attaches over the joint it's working on. Another example, hamstrings. Do you see? Okay, hamstrings come down past the knee, and as I pull the heel up, engaging the hamstring, what joint am I working through? You're working through the knee joint because the muscle crosses that joint. So you have to ask yourself, when you're bringing the knee up or you're bringing the legs up, what muscle crosses the hip joint? Because this is a function of the hip. This is hip flexion. So, what muscles? Which abdominal muscles? Right, none. None of the abdominal muscles cross the hip joint. What does? The psoas. So the psoas is actually one of 2 muscles that comprises the hip flexor. A lot of people think of hip flexors as one thing. It's actually 2 different muscles. So if you find kind of bony hip bone right out in front, whatever muscle's directly underneath that, that's what most people think of as the hip flexor. That's actually the iliacus. Psoas starts up further. It actually starts kind of back in the spine, then it snakes through and comes out in front. So the psoas actually comes more toward the medial part of that leg. So when you think of the hip flexor, it's not just that muscle directly beneath the bone, it's actually wraps inside as well. So the psoas is the primary flexor of the hip. So the entire movement that we just talked about, the flexion of the lumbar spine or bracing the lumbar spine in that neutral position, that's like, yeah, that's ab work. We never mentioned the legs. The leg raise is a hip flexor movement. So you can do your leg raises all day long. You just have to know that that's a hip flexor movement, not an ab movement. So it's the control of the lumbar spine, either that neutral spine position or the flexion of the lumbar spine. That's what's going to be working the abs. It's not the leg raise. The leg raise is just working the psoas. If you're trying to do a heavy ab workout and you're doing a ton of leg raises, or just any sort of movement where you're bringing the knees up and going into hip flexion, you're just hammering the hip flexors, and unless you understand the position of the lower back, then you might not be getting as good an ab workout as you think. It's important to note why the hollow position is so vital to like any basic shape that a person can get into. Like if you can't get into a good hollow position, you probably lack the control and or the strength to sort of get the flexion of that lumbar spine. And then a lot of your abdominal movements, if you don't have that control, it's going to be largely hip flexor. Anytime your knees are coming up or anytime you're going into hip flexion, you're just going to be hammering the hip flexors. And if the back's not in a good position, you're really not getting an ab workout at all.